Welcome to the Trent England Show. Happy Thursday. It's our last show of this week, which means it's our last show of May no matter what, but our first show of June will be Monday. I hope you'll be with us and we'll have a great weekend. Today we're going to talk about argument. I'm an attorney, so I like argument. But look, argument's gotten a bad rap. It's like rhetoric. People use the word rhetoric. Oh, that's just rhetoric. It's some kind of slight. People don't like it when people argue. But we're going to get back to the heart of all this, right? When people argue in politics, it's supposed to be, the words actually originally meant, right, trying to convey ideas, right, up against other ideas through a process that could actually make us smarter, maybe even better people, maybe even have a better country, right? If we can't do that, we are doomed if we can't actually talk together. I have several examples of just pathetic argument, and all these come from the left, two of them from the Washington Post, one of them from the Huffington Post, so they come from the far reaches of the far left. But they apply across the spectrum. And I mean, look, this is, if you're a conservative, a libertarian, a moderate, whatever you consider yourself to be, you owe it to yourself and to your country. We all owe it to ourselves and to our country and to the great state of Oklahoma to try to actually make our arguments in ways that make sense and to confront other people's arguments in ways that don't dismiss them out of hand, like I'm going to talk about in just a minute. I've got some great, some really inflammatory examples that just have come out in the last couple of days. Let's start off with in a way, this is the dumbest one. I'm going to start with this. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. This is a Huffington Post story, so you wouldn't expect it to require a lot of brain power. But this is a Huffington Post story that comes, I guess, from the ACLU. That's what it says in the byline. Emily Peck, the writer here, the headline is, "Everyone is missing a key reason the U.S. birth rate is declining." What does Ms. Peck here tell us? She tells us that the subhead is, "In the U.S., women are essentially punished for having kids." That word essentially is a little tell, like I'm not really making a serious argument, I can't prove it, I'm just sort of throwing this out there. But let's take this seriously for just a minute, because look, this is not implausible. Obviously, you have a young woman here who believes so strongly that American public policy, U.S. public policy, is bad for women. This is what she believes. You read the story, and she thinks that companies should be required to infantilize their employees and pay for them to take as much time off as they want for having kids and all these other things, right? She thinks that we should have all of these social programs, expensive government programs that give stuff away to people who have kids. Like, that's one point of view, right? I don't agree with that. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But that's a point of view. She believes that really strongly. This is instructive, right? So she believes that so strongly that when the report came out earlier this month that the U.S. birth rate has gone down even more, right? U.S. birth rate's below the replacement rate when you don't take into account immigration, right? When she sees this, she says, aha, right? She has this overarching, probably her reason for living, she probably feels that way, right, is standing up for women's rights and trying to give politicians more of a role in the lives of women and mothers, right? And so she says, this is evidence of that, right? And if you know nothing else, you have one presupposition, you don't know anything about the rest of the world, then that sounds reasonable, right? The problem is, she doesn't know anything about the rest of the world. She doesn't know anything. I mean, the story is just that. That's all it is, right? It's these policies are bad because she believes that, and the birth rate is declining, and so those two things correlate together for her, and so that must be causation. Let me just throw out a couple things here. You probably already know this. You probably recognize this as soon as I read the subhead to this story. If you look around the world, there are policies that actually have that actually do the things that Ms. Peck wants the United States to do, right? As far as giving, creating all of these social welfare programs for women and for mothers. And there are countries that do that and have lower birth rates than we have in the United States, even after the most recent decline, right? So that is, that runs really counter to this story. She doesn't mention it in the story. She probably doesn't even know that. I don't know. I don't know what she knows. I mean, if she knows that she's being disingenuous, she may not know, right? What else? What else? Just looking around the world, right? There are countries that have no social safety nets for women, right? There are countries, you know, where the governments are very weak, right? And yet they have very high birth rates, right? I mean, this is actually a fact about the third world, or what are we supposed to call it? We called it when I was a kid the third world. Now I think we're supposed to call it the developing world. I don't know. Maybe there's a different word out there now. But we know that in those countries, those are the countries with the highest birth rates in the world, right? They don't have any of this social welfare stuff, right? So right there, all you have to do is take a global snapshot. And we know that Ms. Peck over at the Huffington Post has no story, no narrative. The correlation is not causation. What if you go back through American history? I mean, this is what I think is maybe even more compelling. You go back to, in American history, you go back to the 19th century, where the birth rate and population growth, really, because the birth rate had been high, but all of a sudden, Americans were very healthy. We were living a lot, well, more children were surviving to adulthood, basically, is what happened early in the 19th century, and the population growth rate in the United States went through the roof, maybe faster than any large civilization has ever experienced. Did we have, you know, equal pay laws for women? Did we have paid leave for women, right? No. I mean, look, she has, if you know nothing about the world, right, then it's reasonable that somebody would come to, I guess, the sort of conclusion that she came to. But as soon as you start looking around for more information, you discover it just can't be true. No matter how, and here's the point about this story, and then I'm going to get into a couple more important stories, really, that aren't so easy, perhaps, to dissect. The really important thing is we all have causes, right? We all have things we believe really strongly. Maybe they're political, maybe they're not, maybe it's about something else, right? We have things we believe in, right, to our very core, and it's easy to look around at the world around us and interpret everything in light of our preconceptions and disregard all evidence to the contrary. That's what Emily Peck does here in the Huffington Post, but it is actually doing a disservice to those things we believe, because what do we just do with this, right? We just disproved it. It was very easy to do. We lose our credibility when we see the world through such a narrow lens. Okay, let's get to a couple of other stories here. And again, I mean, these are all from the left because they're from the Washington Post, but this applies across the board. And I bring it to our attention partly because the Washington Post deserves to be made fun of, but partly because I just want us all to become, especially, I mean, look, if you're a liberal, you should just tune this out. I don't want you to become better at arguing your point of view. I don't want you watching the show for the next, few minutes. If you're a conservative, if you're somebody who actually believes in the principles that made the great state of Oklahoma great, that made the United States a great and exceptional country, then I really hope that all of us take these things, take these principles, and put them into effective argument. What's the first story we have here from the Washington Post? Well, we get this all the time. School choice, they tell us, is about money. This is all, the two stories from the Washington Post are about attacking people's intentions and attacking people as people and attacking the origins of ideas rather than grappling with those ideas themselves. You've heard this before, right? That this is always what they say. When you get into a school choice debate with folks on the left, well, you're just there are big corporations out there, and they're trying to make money off of school choice, and that's why you want to divert public money to private, educational enterprises. And look, a couple things about this argument that make it, again, sort of like the Huffington Post piece, obviously not true. The public education system enriches all kinds of private interests, starting with the people who work in it. And it is not an insult to say that that if you're a public school teacher, you do it partly for the money. You make money. You're paid to do that, right? A school superintendent is obviously, doing it for the money. I mean, you look at school superintendent salaries in Oklahoma, a lot of superintendents make really good money, right? And they climb up that ladder, right, to go from one position to another. Not in all cases, right? There are obvious examples of people out there who are very self-sacrificial, but still, do they do it for nothing? No, they don't do it for nothing. They can't do it for nothing, right? Beyond that, though, did you know that the public education system, the traditional public education system, actually enriches a lot of private corporate interests? Did you know that? Like, anybody who knows anything about public schools knows that that's true. Right? You've got all these curriculum companies out there. I mean, these are billion dollar companies, right? I mean, some of them are the small ones are $1 million companies. The big ones are $1 billion multinational corporations that make curriculum products and sell them into public schools. These are private corporations that make a tremendous amount of money off of the traditional public school system. Architecture firms, we talked about this here in the great state of Oklahoma. Architecture firms, building companies, right? There are lots of private businesses that make much of, and in some cases pretty much all of their money off of the existing public system. So to say that, well, we shouldn't have public money going to private, it's either disingenuous or it just exposes the fact that people just don't know the way the world works around them. Right? So, I mean, this is one of the basic problems with this argument. But going even deeper, it's an argument against people's intentions. It is the worst kind of political argument. Because not only does it not address someone's ideas, but it puts that person in a category where their ideas never deserve to be addressed. They never deserve to be addressed. Maybe they deserve to be isolated, if not imprisoned, because they have bad intent, right? This literally is the path to tyranny. If you look at any tyranny, if you look at governments that commit the worst atrocities like genocide, it always begins with this kind of argument. And I'm not attributing this to any particular side in the United States, right? I mean, I do think you see it more on one side than the other, but I will say this, you see it on all sides, right? Where people address other people's arguments by saying, well, we don't have to address their arguments because they're bad people, right? So this is this school choice story. We get this from the Washington Post. I think the Washington Post has become really one of the examples of really pernicious, nasty political rhetoric like this. Here's the one that I just saw. Here's the one that caught my eye that I wanted to cover this because I just saw this story break in the Washington Post, and I suspect we'll see it pushed around all sorts of places. The story is welfare reform is racist. And this is directly going after, I mean, if you look at the headline there, this is directly going after people based on their intentions. Headline is, White America's racial resentment is the real impetus for welfare cuts, comma, study says. Now, let me tell you one thing about this article before we dig into the fallacies here. One thing about this article is, right, if you read into it, they actually point out that the researchers do say that they could be wrong. And there are studies that show other things, right? But the Washington Post gets its headline. The writer here, Caitlin Dewey, gets her headline. She gets her dig in. This gets put in the Washington Post with the appropriate caveats, and then it'll get pushed around by partisans without those caveats to say that, well, what do they say? Let's get to some of these logical fallacies that are really embedded in this multi-layer cake of logical fallacies. The first one is not so obvious because it's really fundamental and it happens all the time in politics. This is the no true Scotsman fallacy. The fallacy goes like this, right? You say something, you say welfare should be reformed. We need welfare reform. We need fewer people on welfare and more people working. And the other side reacts by saying, no good person would ever say that. Period, right? This is, I mean, we all run into this in politics, right? Where we hear ideas that we disagree with. You just think, no good person could have such an idea, right? No true Scotsman would do things that way, would want that, right? And so therefore, right, I don't have to address it. I'm just shutting down the argument altogether. Or I'm going to come up with it. Now I don't have to address your argument. I have to explain why you're not a true Scotsman. I have to explain why you're a bad person, right? So that's the fundamental preconception of people who write articles like this, people who do quote unquote studies like this. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about why this study is, these things are bogus. I've dug into these before and come to understand why these quote unquote studies really at their very core they are fundamentally flawed and based on some lies. But we don't have to go there right at the beginning, right? We're just talking about basically the people who write stories like this and try to engage in political arguments this way, right? So the starting point is, well, if people want to reform welfare, if they want fewer people dependent on politicians, if they want fewer tax consumers and more taxpayers, then they must be bad people. So now we have to go and explain it. And what do they do? One of the things that they do, you see this actually a lot in school choice arguments, you see it in all kinds of political arguments, is another fallacy. This fallacy is called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy. I love this website, by the way, Your Fallacy. It's great for posting, in Facebook conversations or Twitter conversations. You don't have to say anything. You just post it, a little image pops up and says, your logical fallacy is genetic. The genetic fallacy goes like this, right? Well, these ideas came from somewhere, and we don't like where these ideas came from. Therefore, we don't have to argue about the ideas. We just, we just point out, well, they came from over here. They have some connection to something. You get this, frankly, you get this with Nazism on both sides. You have people on the right and people on the left who say, well, the Nazis did something sort of similar to that. And so, you get this when it comes to the gun debate, right? People say, well, the Nazis banned guns, so therefore gun bans are bad. Well, no, there's a good argument there, right? Totalitarian regimes disarm people because you need people to be disarmed so that you can turn them into slaves. That's an actual argument, right? The Nazis did this, therefore, if you're arguing that this should be done again, you're a Nazi. That's not a good argument, right? Obviously, that's the genetic fallacy. You'll see this. You actually see this on both sides of the abortion debate, right? People will say, I've seen people say, well, the Nazis outlawed abortion. Well, they outlawed abortion for certain people, and then they murdered a lot of other people. They obviously didn't believe in the sanctity of life. But people will say, well, your idea, there was some Nazi somewhere in the 1930s who did something sort of like this, so therefore you're a Nazi and I don't have to address your ideas. That's the genetic fallacy. Again, these are ways to not only shut down debate, but to isolate people and to put people in a category where we don't have to listen to them, and maybe we don't even have to treat them as other human beings. It's not just bad argumentation, it's actually dangerous. This is actually slippery slope is sometimes a fallacy, but it's not always a fallacy. Eugene Volokh, great legal scholar, wrote a really important paper on how slippery slopes, sometimes a fallacy, sometimes it's true. Look, you don't want to set yourself on, let alone push your countrymen down a slippery slope to viewing people as somehow less than human, right? What else is going on here? Okay, the final fallacy. This is probably the one that you thought of first. This is the one that people talk about most of all, and really gets to the heart of a paper like this or an article like this. That's the AdHominem Fallacy. It's we just think you're a bad person. Right? You have come to us with a certain kind of argument, and we're going to turn around and we're going to say you're a bad person, you're a money grubber, right? You are a racist, whatever it is. We get this all the time, and conservatives get this all the time. Look, if you're a liberal, post in the comments and tell me how you think conservatives do this to you, because I will be honest, I don't see mainstream conservative thinkers and people working in public policy on the conservative side and conservative publications like National Review or Weekly Standard or whatever you like, American Conservative. I don't see those outlets writing the kind of stories you see in the Washington Post and that you see in the Huffington Post that turn to the left and say, look, we don't have to address your arguments. We're just going to find ways to explain why you're evil. Right? I actually don't see that from serious conservative thinkers out there. But if you're a liberal and you're watching this show, I invite you to try to offer us examples. Right? This whole article in the Washington Post is about how they don't have to confront arguments about welfare reform because somehow some group of people out there who support welfare reform, and look, even if you read a study like this and you think the study is true, all it shows is that some small percentage of people, right, have a certain belief. It doesn't mean that all people who believe a certain thing share that belief. Right? What the study authors did here was they looked at changing views about welfare reform over time, and then they attribute an increase in support for welfare reform to racism, basically. But that increase is small, right? It's relatively small, right? They're not even claiming to explain everything. But the Washington Post then takes that study, and this is frankly how things work. This comes from Berkeley. University of California, Berkeley. It goes to the Washington Post. The Washington Post presents it in a way that then it can be turned into more direct partisan propaganda, right? And the study actually, if you go and you read the study, it's going to say, well, we only claim to explain small percentage of these things, and it's a limited study, and there are other things to consider, and it may not be right, and it may be correlation and not causation, all that. And the Washington Post says, well, there's a study that says if you believe in welfare reform, you're a racist, and then other people can go out there and just say it's been proven that if you believe in welfare reform, you're a racist, right? I mean, that's the progression here. The Washington Post is playing a role in this that only organs like that can play. What's wrong with that? I mean, what's fundamentally wrong with both that argument and the study? Well, look, for one thing, most welfare recipients are not racial minorities, right? So, I mean, that's one problem with this. And one of the things that the study authors did is they actually lied to people about that fact to see if they could get people to be more in favor of welfare reform if they had incorrect information, which I thought was kind of an interesting tactic. But look, I mean, one of the things we know in Oklahoma about welfare, especially Medicaid, is Medicaid has grown while the state has become wealthier, right? I mean, there are really basic rational reasons for people to look at that system and say, something's wrong with this, right? How can it be that as the state gets wealthier and when unemployment is very low, how can it be that we have more than half the babies born in Oklahoma born on medical welfare, right? How does that work out, right? What's going on there? I mean, these are questions reasonable people ask, and they're the same questions that the Washington Post is trying to shut down and prevent people from asking by suggesting that by asking that question, you may be a racist, right? I mean, how pernicious, how wrong-headed is that approach to our public policy debates? But even beyond that, right, whether it's school choice or welfare reform or anything else, there are arguments that people make that go like this, right? People would be better off if they were less dependent on government. People would be better off if they were working rather than receiving a handout, right? And I think it's very telling that a lot of the folks on the left who oppose those policies don't actually want to engage on those premises, right? Don't actually want to have a conversation about the arguments based on those premises, right? And instead, I mean, the Huffington Post is not a small media outfit. I mean, it's small-ish, right? The Washington Post is a very large media outfit owned by Jeff Bezos from Amazon, right? I mean, this is a big corporation, right? And they're putting their effort not in making some counter-argument, not in having some serious debate about whether people are better off under one system or another or with one policy or another. They're actually investing their efforts in attacking people's motives, right? In calling people racist. It's very revealing. And that's why I wanted to talk about it here on the Trent England Show today. I hope this is helpful. It's interesting. It's a little different than what we usually do on the program, but I'd seen this slew of stories out there with all of these logical fallacies, and I thought, let's take a Thursday afternoon and go through some of these. I'll post the links up to these stories if you want to go and look at them yourselves. I'll post the link up to the Your Fallacy Is website, so you can use that in your Facebook or Twitter diatribes to the extent that that's useful to you. And of course, we all should. The great thing I feel like is I have sort of explored this world of logical fallacies more than I have for years and thought it through. Is the great thing is, hopefully, as we call other people out for it, we also become better at not doing it ourselves, right? And that's what I really want. I really want, for me, for you, for all of us, I want us to be able to have grown-up conversations about public policy in the great state of Oklahoma and across the great US of A. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.